There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
This is a particular delight because Joe, formerly of Retired Book Nerd, the fabulous BookTube channel, is with me today. Joe from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Hello.
Hello, Sean. Thank you for having me.
What an absolute delight. Joe and I didn't have a whole lot to do with each other when she was active on BookTube, but I left a comment or two, and maybe she did too. But really excited to be chatting with her and her showing her lovely face on BookTube again.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very, very excited to do this and hope that maybe we could do it another time.
I would love that. And the people that have been missing your channel like crazy are going to be so excited to see you here.
I hope so.
You have a quasi announcement to make, don't you?
I have a quasi announcement to make, and I can't give a time stamp to it, but I am planning on coming back to BookTube, getting my channel started again, I hope in this calendar year.
That is the best news I've heard all day. So fantastic. Good. Do you envision that your channel will be much the same as it was, or kind of go off in a different direction?
No, I actually envision it to be what it was pretty much. I expect to have several haul videos. There.
Don't worry about that.
Okay. There are two dogs here, and every time someone goes out of the apartment across the hall, they get excited.
No worries.
I think that probably because I have decreased my personal library so much that at the very beginning there will be quite a bit of book hauling going on, because as I try to get back and build that back up, because I had such a big personal library that I miss very much after moving.
Be stocking up. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And what kind of stuff do you like to read, Joe?
Well, actually, if you think about my channel, I read almost everything. I do consider myself to be very eclectic in that. Literary fiction would be my favorite, but I also tell people that sometimes I love to read horror because I need a little palate cleanser from the deep thoughts that come up when you read so much literary fiction. And for me, that's a good way to just enjoy a quick read. And I don't care if I catch all the elements, it's just, I'm not trying to learn from it. If I do, that's great, but I'm not trying to glean something personal from it. Probably the only thing you won't see much of on my channel would be romance. That's really about the only thing that I don't read very often.
I read that in common.
Yeah, it's not my thing.
And you have some bookish enterprises going on. Tell us about your Etsy store.
I do. Right now, my store is on vacation because I have just moved in the last few months, but I have also been creating big things for my Etsy store, which is called Scrappy Treasures by Joe. Within the next few months, I'm hoping to have quite a bit of product going on there. And those things will be handmade journals and handmade journal items like bookmarks and journaling cards and tags and miniature notebooks and things like that that I make mostly out of junk.
Wow.
So, yeah, I use a lot of junk mail and make a lot of stuff or paper scraps.
Huh.
So, yeah.
By the time this interview goes up, your inventory may be replenished by then. So I'm going to put a link to your Etsy store as well.
Okay, that'd be great.
That's fantastic. We are here to talk about Amor Towles' latest novel, The Lincoln Highway, which you loved.
Yes, I did. I loved it. This is the big, hefty weighing in at 576 pages. It's a big one.
Just came out a few months ago or something. Tell us why you loved it.
Well, it's an adventure story, I would say, overall, but I loved the characters that he portrayed in this novel. And I loved the key to the Lincoln Highway was an actual thing. So that part is true. And he then made that story go around that real thing of the Lincoln Highway. And I jotted down a couple of notes because I thought people might be interested in that. The Lincoln Highway was actually finished in 1916 and did not become completely paved until 1935. And it spans from New York City to San Francisco. And now of course, the highways are still there, but it does not hold that name anymore. It's several US this and US that, numbers, but you can still be on the Lincoln Highway at some point, but it's not called that. But anyway, he set the story around that, and the story is actually set in 1954. I've heard some criticisms that say that the adventure story got a little too wordy toward the middle. And I would say that I felt a little bit of that, but for the most part, I felt like he was character scooping us, for that. The characters, I think, are just fantastic. And the main character is supposed to be Emmett Watson. He's an 18-year-old. We find out fairly soon in the book, but I won't reveal that he's committed a crime. And since he was only 18, he was sent to a work farm, sort of like a prison. But anyway, he was on a work farm and lived with a bunch of other boys that had also committed some sort of crime. And his father has passed away at the very beginning while he was in the camp, and he has an 8-year-old brother. So they release him from the camp so that he can go home and take care of his brother, because even though mother is very important to the story, she's never actually in it. I don't know if that makes sense, but she does not appear as a character, but her life is extremely important to the story.
That's quite tantalizing.
Yes, and I liked that part. It's kind of like having that secret almost, even though we know what's going on. There's a lot of mystery surrounding mom. So his younger brother, Billy, only has him. So they release him. The warden takes him to Nebraska, where he lived, and takes him home so that he can sell the family farm. It has actually gone under bankrupt, we find out. But anyway, he wants to just go to California and build a new life with his brother, because he learned building skills while he was there. And he had a job when he was younger, helping a carpenter, and he thought he could make a life for him and his brother. And when the warden takes him home, what they don't know for a while is that 2 of his fellow prison people have hid in the trunk of the warden's car.
Yikes.
And the warden leaves and goes back to the camp, and then suddenly his 2 friends show up. And the 2 friends are very, very different. There's Duchess, who is a dreamer. He's got an idea for everything. And then there's Wooly, who is a little bit too kind for his own good. He's so likable and so wonderful. And so the problem comes in that Emmett had an idea of what he wanted to do with life now that his father had passed away. But his younger brother, Billy, who I still say is the main character in the story, even though everybody else says Emmett Watson is, I don't agree. Billy is the main character because he drives everything important that happens in this story. And Duchess helps a lot of that happen too, because he's always in a mess. And so that's where the adventure comes in, is that they have these exploits. Towles brings in Shakespeare. The story of Ulysses comes up in this very importantly. The Bible plays a strong role in it. There's a lot of stuff about that. It's the shenanigans of them trying to get where they want to go, and why the Lincoln Highway plays into that. So I won't tell, because that's very important. But Lincoln Highway plays into it really well.
And what a fabulous job you've done of tantalizing us all without the slightest bit of spoilery stuff.
I tried not to.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm aware that it's kind of a Marmite book. People seem to either love it or hate it. And people that loved his earlier novels sometimes struggle that this is quite a departure. Have you read any of his other stuff?
I have not. And I was going to say, I think that's where it has come in. I don't know. I own actually both of his other books. Olive from A Book Olive, one of my favorite channels to watch. Rules of Civility is her absolute favorite book of all time.
Yes,
so
I
it
got
is
on
on
her
my
good side because I loved it too.
yes. Well, she says that I think she actually did a review of the Lincoln Highway, but I know that when I heard her talking about it, she was not as crazy about it. And I
The
think that
Lincoln
probably
Highway.
the reason I could love it was because I don't know his other work yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm anxious to see where I land on this one afterwards.
That's right.
But it was a great adventure for me.
But you have totally sold me. I can't wait to try it, Joe.
Yeah.
And you've already said you're coming back, so I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay.
I am very excited to have a new guest, Kaviya from Singapore. Kaviya, welcome.
Oh, hi, Sean. It's nice to meet with you.
It's really great to meet you. And we recently became Goodreads friends. And within the days, I had found a book that Kaviya had recently read that I was very interested in. And so here we are. The book is a collection of short stories, and I actually have my own copy. I will show it here. It's a beautiful, I think the British edition, Swimmer Among the Stars by Kanishk, Tharoor, and written in English and came out in 2016. And I will share my little story about it in a minute or two. But Kaviya, you quite like this collection. Tell us why.
Possibly because it's really eclectic and it's very different from other short story collections that I've read before. And one of my favorites was Portraits with Cold Fire, which, initially before reading this book, I heard it was based on a true story. And I guess once you read it, you sort of feel connected to it. There's a lot of different elements, and I love Tharoor's affection with history, culture, and archaeology. And reading this, made me feel really connected to my culture, in fact, and maybe because, Tharoor is probably closer to my home, that's also a connection. So I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Great. Can you tell us the name of that story again?
Portraits with Cold Fire.
Portrait with Cold Fire. Okay, I see that. So you're originally from India, right?
Yes, I am.
And Kanishk Tharoor was born in India, now I think lives in America.
Yes, if I'm not wrong, in New York. I'm not very sure, but yeah.
That's what I saw too. Great. And so let me tell you my little story. I had a friend at Christmas time that got a concussion, and she is a voracious reader. She reads twice as much as I do, and I read a lot. She probably reads 3 times as much as I do. And she couldn't read for several weeks because of recovering from her concussion. So she lives in Canada and I live in Tokyo, but through the magic of this voicemail app called Voxer, I read to her for 1 or 2 hours a day for about 5 weeks, or I don't know, a month or something, picking books off my shelf or off my Kindle that I had never tried. And one of the very last days we did it was the title story to Swimmer Among the Stars. And we both loved that story. So that's the title story. And that's the only one I've read. And it blew me away because there was something very intellectual about it, but yet it had a real emotional undertow. It was unlike any other short story I've read, certainly in many years. So that's why I was so alive to this book. And when I saw that you had read it, I invited you on. So yes. How would you describe this guy's writing style?
Initially, when I was reading, I read The Swimmer Among Stars, the first story, and I was like, I didn't know if it's getting it right. There are certain spaces where there's a lot of time lapses, and I was not sure if I got into his space. But then once I started reading, when 2-3 pages in, I really loved it. And there's a lot of emotional connect to it. The way he writes, you immediately connect to it. And also because I live in Singapore, but my mother tongue is like Tamil and it's closer to India. And I sort of felt how, the old lady in the story you can empathize with the person. And that's what a good story has to do. You have to make you connect with.
Exactly. And so the premise of that story is that this woman, the protagonist, she is the last speaker of her language. The language isn't named. And so she is interviewed by ethnographers, and they want to record her speaking her language. And so they're very clinical and detached. It's kind of like a laboratory feeling. It's kind of a psycholinguistic laboratory, I guess. And she is just an absolutely warm, emotional, very open person, and she kind of seduces them to start to view her as a person and not as an object of study. And yet their questions or their project makes her think about her own language in other ways, and takes her on memories, and she sings songs, and then she wants to rewrite the songs, and I just found it beguiling.
Yes, I mean, did you realize this? Like, she comes up with words for stuff like rocket. I think she says something like fury, flight, into void, or something. And she comes up with a word for astronaut, which is like the title of the story. And all of those little bits and pieces are very interesting to read. And she also says something like, "There's no word for tractor," and I went back to my mother tongue and wanted to know if there's a word for tractor. I didn't find any, and that's probably true for his mother tongue also. In Malayalam, there's no word for tractor. So
right,
all of that was interesting.
Tell me again, what's your mother tongue?
My mother tongue is Tamil, which is very similar to Malayalam, which could be Kanishk's mother tongue, I guess.
Tell us about one or two other of the stories that you particularly liked.
The other one that I really, really liked is Portraits with Coal Fire, which the premise of the story is a worker from a remote coal plant tries to talk to a journalist who published his photo in the magazine. And he tries to, talk to the journalist to see why did he publish that particular picture. And there's a lot of intricacies. I don't want to spoil it for anyone. And the way the conversation goes is very natural, very honest. And you could see through the eyes of anybody who's working in a coal plant. And I just couldn't forget it. It was always in my mind. It's still in my mind. And
certainly relate to the part about it sticking in your mind, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about the title story in the same way. This is the author, Kanishk, Tharoor's only book so far, and it came out in 2016. What can you tell us about the author? And apparently he has a very famous father.
Shashi Tharoor, I've been following him on Twitter for a long time. I didn't know he had a son, to be really honest. I just found out Kanishk is his son. And I've been following his tweets, and I've read one of his books also. He's like...
this is the father's books?
Yes.
And his name is?
Shashi Tharoor.
Right.
Yeah, I've read one of his books, and he used to be part of Undersecretary to Kofi Annan, I guess. He was in UN. That's how, the New York connection, I suppose. And
I gather, not just from doing a quick scan of the father, Shashi Tharoor's Wikipedia page, that he, like you said, he was Undersecretary of the UN. And now he's a politician, but he's been a diplomat, a writer, a public intellectual. Done a whole bunch of stuff. Had a whole bunch of wives, and one of the wives, the first wife, is Kanishk Tharoor's mother. And she comes from that wife comes from a very famous political family too, if I understand it correctly. Yes. Kaviya, you're a great guest. Will you come back?
I hope so. Thanks, Dr. Sean. Thank you for inviting me.
James from Adelaide, Australia is back. James, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you.
Well, you are just a reader extraordinaire, and you read such good stuff. I could have you on every episode of Bite Size Book Chat. So thank you for coming back again. And today you're here to talk about a book that was your most anticipated release of 2022, a collection of stories by Tove Ditlevsen, the Danish writer. In English translation, it is called The Trouble with Happiness and Other Stories. And who is the translator?
The translator is, it is Michael Favala Goldman.
Okay, because that isn't listed on the Goodreads page, which is very strange.
No, her other stuff, I think, has been translated by Tiina Nunnally, I think. Yeah, the other is a different translator. But yeah, so that's...
So there's a good...
And yes, it only came out about a month or so ago, I think.
Yes. And so did it live up to the hype? Did it live up to your expectations?
It did very much so. It's actually, I found it seems to be a combination of an anthology of two of her story collections. So there are others out there that haven't been combined in here. I mean, it's still fairly slim, even so. It's only about 180 pages. But yeah, very, very good throughout. Like the quality is high throughout. It's not one of those collections where, there's a couple of good stories and then some real duds and you go, eh. So no, I really, really loved it.
Okay, now I was going to say, assume I know nothing about Tove Ditlevsen and tell me about her and her writing. And actually, that's true. You don't have to assume. It is kind of true. I don't know very much about Tove Ditlevsen. She's a Twitter darling, and her trilogy is very popular.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's
her trilogy of memoirs.
The trilogy is here, the Copenhagen Trilogy, which is a very thinly veiled autobiography. Childhood, youth, and dependency are the individual books. Yes, you grew up, I think, reasonably poor circumstances in Copenhagen, and wanted to be an artist, wanted to be a writer, and I think a fairly unsympathetic family. And then when she basically left her family and got married, I think her husband was, I can't remember if it was morphine or heroin specifically, but her husband helped kind of get her hooked on, I think, morphine. And then she never quite shook it off. So she ended up, I think she committed suicide when she was only in her 50s, I think. Yeah, sleeping pill overdose. And the other book of hers, it's in English, which is The Faces. Again, I think it's fairly autobiographical. It's about a woman who's been basically committed at one point because she's, having kind of paranoid delusions, and part of it's drug induced and part of it's just because, her husband's fairly horrible and unsupportive and her life is kind of going down the tubes. And, she's trying to be a mother and a wife and a writer, and it's all falling apart. So I liked The Faces, but it was, I think, less successful. The trilogy, the Copenhagen Trilogy, is is the good stuff. Yeah.
And these stories, from reading the synopsis, seem to take up similar themes.
They do. I would be surprised. I mean, she certainly doesn't seem, I haven't read most of her stuff because, of course, it hasn't all come into English, but she certainly seems to be one of those writers who doesn't stray a long way from their own personal lives. But the short stories do, whilst sticking in that same while sticking in that same milieu, the short stories do move around. Like there's short stories from a male perspective, short stories from children's perspectives. So they're all very much in that kind of world that her other books are in, but kind of spread out and taking a more kind of patchwork, fragmented, and different viewpoints. There's no kind of sameness to them. There's a similarity of atmosphere, but certainly not a sameness of things being worn out and over considered again and again in different stories.
What is that famous quote? Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Yes, well, her family is very unhappy and in very original ways. So.
And the characters in these stories are unalike in their unhappiness.
That's right. There's a lot of unhappy people, a lot of mad people, a lot of neglected people, a lot of confused people, but very well written people. So.
So literary short stories are typically not happy stories or have happy endings. This collection sounds particularly bleak, would you say?
It does, I think, have that bleakness. But having said that, the stories themselves are actually quite short. I mean, there's, as I said, it's 180 pages, but that's 2 separate books. And each book has about a dozen or so stories in it. So the individual stories, there's not many that would even break 15 pages in length, and a lot of them are a lot shorter. So they're bleak and intense, but they're not books that stories that are sort of stretched out and revel in it. They kind of make their point and piss off, and then there's another one come along to make a different bleak point.
A bleak story well told can be uplifting in its own way, can't it? Just by the
it can be, partly because it's not happening to you, and partly just because something well written has a lively kick to it, even if the story that is being written isn't one that you'd want to personally experience. I mean, having said that, I'm looking around, probably 90% of the stuff in here is bleak as shit, but it's so well written that that doesn't really matter.
And she's described in some of the reviews I read as a modernist writer.
The trilogy that particularly shows because she's got the length of the 3 books to work with, and they kind of, the style at a longer length definitely shows the kind of modernism, this sort of stream of consciousness, and just also the effect as the story goes on of the drug use and the way that kind of changes the kind of consciousness of the person who's telling the story. But even the short stories that shows, I mean, partly too, just the length of the stories. They're not stories that are kind of trying to sit down and tell you a little miniature story with all the kind of texture and detail of everyday life and kind of, the kind of 19th century kind of short story style. They're kind of short, sharp, slightly askew angles. It very much has that feel. I'd be interested to know how much more of her work there is, because as I say, I mean, I think it was 50. She was 59 when she killed herself. But I mean, one of the problems, these Penguin editions are very attractive, but they have no information at all about anything. They don't tell you about. They don't even have a little spiel that tells you about the writer, really. So there's certainly nothing that tells you about how much other work there is that hasn't come out into English. I mean, I could Google it if I wasn't lazy, but I certainly would like to know how much more. I know that there's more short fiction, because I've read a couple of other of her short stories in various anthologies that are not in this collection. So I know there's at least other short stories out there, but I'm not sure what else there is in a longer form. But I would definitely love to read it if it ever makes it into English.
There's a whole pile, according to Wikipedia, and it's dozens of novels, short stories, poems, memoirs, letters, essays.
Right. Well, we need it all now. So.
Would you recommend that I start with some memoirs before I dip into the short stories, or
I do. I mean, as I say, they're not written as memoirs. They are written as novels, but they are obviously very much based on her own life. Okay. But yes, I would definitely start with that. I think they're pretty unimpeachable, really. They're amazing, amazing books.
That is the way I should go about doing that then. James, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Bill from Nairobi is back. Hello, Bill.
Hi guys. Thank you for having me again, Sean.
It's so great.
Always fun.
Yes. And you're going to talk to us about the Olivia Laing nonfiction book. You're going to tell me, I don't know, is it a memoir or what the heck is it? It's called The Lonely City, Adventures in the Art of Being
Alone by Olivia Laing.
Yeah. Oh, you loved it. Tell us why.
So I had tried reading this book a couple of years back, 2 years back, and I don't think I was mentally ready for it, because it really dives into the concept of loneliness, because loneliness is an epidemic, especially in big cities and especially urban spaces. Like, we all have our own routines and our own cocoon. We're all cocooned in different places in the cities, and we don't interact as human beings, and it becomes so hard to find connection. And that's where the story begins. So Olivia Laing moved from the UK to New York City, and she was supposed to move with her partner. Then the partner, something happened, and she found herself at center New York City with no one, no connection, just subletting apartment after apartment and just roaming around like a zombie. And I guess this what sparked inspiration for her to start writing this book about being alone in the city. And it grew into something else, because she zeroed into artists from the past who tried to capture loneliness in a way they didn't know they were capturing loneliness, but they were portraying loneliness through their paintings, movies, activism, just voicing it out. And some died before they could even see their creation the impact of their creation, like, through generation. Right. And she sort of takes us back to that time and her journey, small vignettes of her struggling to cope with this new environment.
And so some of those artists are Andy Warhol.
Yeah, Andy Warhol, Edward
Hopper.
Degas. Edward Hopper, and this Degas.
Henry Degas. I'm not so familiar with him.
So Henry Degas was an outsider artist, meaning he didn't have any classical training in the arts, and used to be this confined janitor in an old church, and he had a very traumatic childhood. And after his retirement from the workplace, the landlord sort of discovered this, cleaning his apartment, discovered this whole array of painting. And they realized how much worth how much of his life was put in this art, and he didn't share with anyone, and the sort of religious metamorphosis. It was such a big thing. I went down this rabbit hole of his life, and it's sort of sad to see that he was confined in this space without expressing, without having any medium to express himself, just creating art for himself. And after his death, his art is now renowned. People like know about it. And that's what the book aims to explore, that space.
So it's memoir, but it's more than memoir.
It's more than memoir.
Cultural
She shines,
criticism.
yeah, sort of thing, yeah, an exploration. But you get bits of her. She doesn't put herself in there as a forefront. She shines light on these famous figures and how their lives mirror her life, her current state, and finding solace between, bridging that gap between loneliness and how art can be accommodating. Like you can find peace and it can bring us together. It's a very meta.
Yeah.
But I think it was successful, yeah.
Well, it was successful for you, so that's fantastic. So, but it's not a self-help book.
It's really not. She doesn't aim to teach you
or
how to be lonely. Yeah, how to eradicate loneliness. That's not her aim. I think her aim is just to take you into the museum and show you these historic figures who are dealing with mental health issues, fighting sexuality. Andy Warhol especially gets a very big portion in the book where they talk about him becoming a machine because he was always detached from his work. But you can't be detached from your work. The loneliness peeps out in his diaries, in his painting, in the way he dressed. He tried to cover it, but he can't.
And that's what the book is about at the core of it. Just an exploration of this artist in isolation.
The success of this book for me as a reader would hinge on what the prose was like. If it was too intellectual and too analytical, I wouldn't be engaged. But if it was somehow more visceral than that, then I think it could be quite stunning.
Yeah, and it's not dense. Like, let's say, like most intellectual nonfiction are like highbrow nonfiction. It was more accessible because I tried listening to it on audio years back, but it didn't quite sit because I think there was attention to detail, and it's because she describes a lot of art and like history, and I had to pause and like research the artist, and that's what made the book engaging. Like she introduces you to so many different personalities, and you have to stop and research for yourself, look at what is out there about them. And I love nonfiction that makes me pause for a second and reflect and think about it. And that's what this book is. The prose is very welcoming because at the beginning of every chapter, she talks about her current state, where she is, the New York light, the neighborhood, her routine before she engages in this intellectual art, the history of these personalities, which I really enjoyed.
We have already established that this is a book that might not be for everyone, and maybe for most people at the right time. And I think that you've put it on a whole bunch of people's radar for when that right time might be for them. So thank you so much for telling us about it.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for having me.